The call came through at 7:14 in the morning while Marcus Webb was parked on Elmore Street, 1 block from his own house, listening. He had not gone to Denver. He had planned to. The client was a restoration project firm with offices in the tech corridor, good work, the kind of contract that justified a 2-day trip and a hotel with a real bed instead of the inflatable one he kept at the workshop for late nights. He had packed his bag Tuesday evening, kissed Claire goodbye at the door, and driven to the airport at 4 in the morning. The cancellation had come through at 5:42. Whether over the Rockies, the gate agent said, the kind of systemic delay that doesn't resolve in hours. He had rescheduled with the client, confirmed by text, and stood in the terminal for a moment thinking about what to do with a cleared day. He had turned toward home because home was where he went. He had not called ahead. He had not thought to. In 11 years of knowing Claire, first as the woman he was falling for and then as his wife, he had never needed to announce himself at the door of his own house. The flight had been canceled, whether over the Rockies, 48 hours of delays, and a client who rescheduled by text without apology. Marcus had driven back from the airport in the gray pre-dawn, and instead of pulling into his own driveway, he had stopped on Elmore, where the kitchen window of his house was visible through the neighbor's oak tree, and the window was open the way it always was in September, and Claire was talking. She was talking to Devon. Marcus had turned off the engine. He had sat with both hands flat on his steering wheel and listened. By the end of it, he understood everything that had been arranged, everything that had been planned, everything that Devon Sarge believed about the man sitting 1 street away in a quiet car with a canceled boarding pass in his jacket pocket. He's so deep in his work, Devon had said. He doesn't even know what he has. Marcus had looked through the windshield at the oak tree, at the yellow light in his own kitchen window, at the ordinary September morning going about its business. Then he had driven away without making a sound. He would not show his hand for 11 more weeks. Marcus Webb had been building things since he was 9 years old, not the kind of building that came from instruction or natural talent, though both arrived later, the kind that came from necessity. From a father who left things half-finished, and a mother who needed them finished, and a boy who figured out early that a hammer in his hand was the one circumstance under which his world could be made more solid than it currently was. By 13, he was rebuilding fence sections for neighbors on weekends. By 16, he had enough tool knowledge to do rough carpentry alongside his Uncle Frank at Frank's Restoration Company. By 22, he had his contractor's license and a reputation in 3 counties for work that lasted. What Marcus built held. That was the standard he had applied to everything. Not the fastest, not the cheapest. The standard that held. He had met Claire Donnelly at a job site fundraiser in 2015. She worked in development at a nonprofit that restored historic buildings, not the physical work, the funding side, and she had strong opinions about what the money should go toward, and she expressed them without hesitation, which Marcus had immediately respected. She was direct. She was precise. She laughed quickly and meant it. They were married in October 2017. He was 37. She was 34. He knew what she could be capable of. He had seen it in the early years. When his mother was sick, a slow, grinding 18 months of a cardiac condition that required monitoring and medication adjustments and long hospital stays, Claire had been the one who coordinated the appointments, tracked the medications, sat with Diane Webb through 2 procedures when Marcus was 3 states away on a job that couldn't wait. She had done it without being asked, without making it into a debt. That was the version of Claire he had married. He did not know when that version had receded, and the other one had moved in to take its place. He suspected it had happened gradually, the way most structural failures happen, not in one catastrophic moment, but in the slow accumulation of small stresses until the day the thing simply gave way. She had been in the early years exactly what he had believed she was. The morning after their first date, she had texted him a photograph of the building they had talked about at dinner, a 1920s commercial structure in the warehouse district that she was trying to secure funding to restore. No message with the photograph, just the image. He had understood immediately that it was her way of saying, I was paying attention. He had paid attention too. He had spent 3 years paying attention before he asked her to marry him, and by then he knew her the way he knew a structure, not just the visible surface but the underlying thing, the thing the surface was built on. He knew that she was generous with people who needed generosity and exacting with people who didn't need managing. He knew that she was hard on herself in the quiet hours and hid it well. He knew that when she was frightened she became efficient, because efficiency was the armor she had learned to put on. He had known all of that. He had believed it was enough. What he knew was this: for the last 14 months, Claire had been somewhere he couldn't quite reach. Present in the house, present at dinners, present in the ordinary machinery of their shared life, but angled slightly away, the way a person stands when they are already moving toward a door they haven't opened yet. He had noticed. He always noticed. He just hadn't known what he was noticing. September changed that. The flight cancellation had been a practical inconvenience. The drive back from the airport had been reflex. He had turned toward home because home was where he went. But when he'd pulled onto their street at 6:55 in the morning and seen Devon Sarge's black Lexus parked 2 houses down at the wrong angle for a man who was supposed to be consulting in Charlotte. Devon had mentioned Charlotte at Marcus and Claire's last dinner party, made a point of mentioning it. Marcus had kept driving. He had turned left onto Elmore. He had parked under the oak tree and rolled down his window. And he had listened to his wife plan the exit from their marriage with the man she intended to walk into next. The conversation had lasted 23 minutes. He knew because he had checked his phone at the start and checked it when Claire closed the kitchen window. 23 minutes. He could have recited it back word for word. The key lines were these. Devon had said the house was the main asset. He had used the phrase the main asset like a man reviewing a balance sheet, which was exactly what he was doing. Claire had agreed. She had mentioned the joint savings, $82,000 built over 7 years, and said she believed she could position for more than half if Marcus's business earnings were used to argue reduced personal contribution to household expenses. She had used a phrase she had clearly gotten from someone she'd already consulted. She said financial participation gap. Devon had asked about Marcus's properties. Claire had said, he doesn't have properties, he has projects. He builds things for other people, that's all he does. Then Devon had said the line that Marcus would carry with him for the next 11 weeks, the line that would sit in the center of everything that followed like a load-bearing post you build the rest of the structure around. He's so deep in his work, he doesn't even know what he has. Marcus had looked at his hands on the steering wheel. He had sat with the full weight of it for a long moment, not just the affair, the calculation. The specific coldness of what was being arranged. Claire had not come to the end of love and found herself without a way to say it. She had mapped what she had access to and what she didn't. She had consulted someone, an attorney probably, given the professional language, and she had built a path designed to let her leave with as much as she could carry. He thought about that path she had built. He thought about the foundation she had not looked for. He thought about the phrase financial participation gap and what it meant about the hours someone had put in before September 19th, the consultations, the inventory of what appeared to be his assets, the careful analysis of the man she had decided to leave. She had been thorough. She had just been working from the wrong floor plan. He thought about the woman who had texted him a photograph of a warehouse building at 8 in the morning on the day after their first date. No message, just the image, knowing he would understand it. The woman who had coordinated his mother's medication schedule across 3 hospitals and 2 insurance systems for 18 months without being asked, and without making it something she was owed. He thought about how long those 2 women, the one who showed up and the one on the other side of the kitchen window, had been the same person. He did not know the answer. He suspected it was not the most important question. The most important question was what he did next. Marcus had looked at his hands on the steering wheel. He had thought about 3 things simultaneously. He had thought about the LLC registered in 2013, 4 years before the wedding, which held the income properties on Garfield on Route 9, and the workshop on Milstead, all acquired before the marriage. None of them ever mentioned to Claire because she had never asked. and because he had kept them separate as a matter of financial habit, not concealment. He had thought about Ray Alcott, who had drafted the original LLC documents and would know exactly what the legal position was. And he had thought about the phrase, "he doesn't even know what he has." He had sat with that one for a while. Then he had started the car. He drove to the diner on Crawford, where he sat in a corner booth and ordered eggs and black coffee and did not touch his phone for 45 minutes. He let the eggs get cold. He drank the coffee. He was not angry. Or rather, the anger was there, structured and present, something solid and real that he could feel in his chest and in his hands, but it had arrived already organized, already shaped into something he could work with rather than be worked by. This was how his mind operated. He had learned it in years of working on things that required more patience than he naturally possessed. You felt the feeling. You let it be what it was. And then you built with it. He had a full picture. He had 11 weeks minimum before Claire would expect any movement. The holidays were coming. She would wait until after. He ordered a second coffee. He picked up his phone and texted Ray Alcott. "Need to sit down. Not urgent tonight. Soon." Ray responded in 4 minutes. "Diner on Crawford." Marcus looked at the booth he was sitting in. "Tomorrow morning," he wrote back. Same booth. He paid for the eggs he hadn't eaten. He drove to the workshop on Milstead, which smelled like old wood and linseed oil, and the 2-year project of restoring the building's original heart pine flooring. He changed into work clothes. He picked up his tools. He worked until dark. Ray Alcott had known Marcus for 19 years, which meant he had known him long enough to understand that when Marcus sat across a table from him with his hands flat on the surface and his coffee untouched, something structural had failed. He did not say anything when Marcus finished. He let the silence sit for a moment, the way a good lawyer lets a room breathe before he fills it. "The LLC," Ray said finally, "3 properties and the workshop, all premarital, all properly documented. She doesn't know. She thinks I build things for other people and that's all I do." Ray nodded slowly. He had a habit of looking at the table when he was thinking, really thinking, not performing thought but doing it, his eyes going down and then coming back up with something assembled. "Her attorney is going to look for commingling," he said. "Whether any marital funds went into the properties. Maintenance, improvements, mortgage payments. The rents have covered everything since 2016. The workshop doesn't have a mortgage. I built half of it myself over 2 years." Ray looked at him. "You've been paying LLC expenses from the LLC accounts. Since the beginning. Ray, you drafted the documents." "I know I did. I'm making sure nothing changed." "Nothing changed." Ray picked up his coffee. "Then you're in a solid position." He said it plainly, without elaboration, the way you say something when the evidence supports it, and theatrical reassurance would be an insult. "The house," Marcus said, "joint asset, that divides." "I know. The savings. 82,000. Half is 50% minus whatever her attorney argues for." Ray set the cup down. "What do you want to do?" Marcus looked at him. "I want the complete picture first," he said. "Everything there is to know before I move an inch." He paused. "And I want to know what Devon Sarge is." Ray understood what that meant. 2 days, he said. Ray's contact, the woman named Petra, came back with a summary in 48 hours. Ray had worked with her before and trusted her speed precisely because she did not pad results with speculation. The summary was 11 pages. Petra's notes were numbered and sparse, each line stripped to what could be verified rather than inferred. Marcus read them at the workshop on the sawhorse with the October light coming in low and direct. Devon Sarge, 41, business development consultant. Mid-sized commercial real estate firm based downtown, 15 people. A glass-fronted office suite on the 12th floor of a building that had been cheap to lease when they took it and was now appreciating with the neighborhood around it. Credentials: an MBA from a state university, 2 industry certifications, a speaking appearance at a regional conference 3 years ago on commercial development trends. Nothing unusual. His personal history was where the picture got more specific. 3 prior relationships in the 6 years Petra could document. 2 of the women had been married at the time. In the first case, the marriage had ended, and the woman had found herself in a financial position significantly less favorable than before. A business venture she had entered with Devon's encouragement had dissolved without the return she had been told to expect. In the second case, the marriage had survived and the woman had not pursued any legal action, which Petra noted was a fact about the woman's choices rather than evidence of Devon's conduct. But the pattern held. He found women in transitions. He made himself available and appealing at the exact moment when someone needed something to be easy. He was not cruel. He did not need to be. He simply moved toward opportunity the way water moves toward low ground, not out of intent exactly, but out of nature, following whatever path was open. Petra's final line in the summary: he has not left a footprint in any of these situations that rises to legal actionability. His exposure is reputational, not criminal. Marcus had read that line twice. He had not been looking for criminal exposure. He had been looking for the shape of the man. He had it now. Devon Sarge turned out to be, as Marcus had suspected, a man built from surface. 41, business development consultant with a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, a LinkedIn profile curated with the care of someone whose professional reputation depended on impression management. 3 prior relationships in the last 6 years, none of them simple. Ray's contact: a woman named Petra who had worked in private investigations for 11 years and did not waste words, had found 2 overlapping timelines in Devon's dating history and at least one situation involving disputed financial arrangements. He had a pattern. He identified women with something worth positioning toward, and he arrived at the right moment. And he was very good at appearing to be the least complicated version of himself until the arrangement was complete. He had not identified Claire in isolation. He had found Marcus Webb's wife and assessed what came with her. Marcus read the summary at the workshop, sitting on a sawhorse with the late October light coming through the restored north window. He read it twice. He set it down beside him on the workbench. He thought about the phrase financial participation gap. Claire had not invented that language. She had been coached. Something like contempt moved through him, not for Claire, not exactly. The contempt was for the specific shape of a man who did this professionally, who arrived in people's lives with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed being the solution to a problem he had partially manufactured. Marcus picked up his chisel. He went back to the floor. He worked for 3 hours without stopping. Uncle Frank Webb came by at 5 in the afternoon, as he did most Tuesdays, on his way home from whatever site he was visiting. He was 68. A compact man with hands like the tools they carried, wide, worn, capable. He came in through the side door without knocking because he had never knocked at any space Marcus was working in and wasn't about to start. He looked at the floor section Marcus had been working on. He crouched down and ran his finger along the seam. "That's good," he said. "Getting there." Frank stood back up. He looked at Marcus. Frank Webb had known his nephew since Marcus was a boy, and he had the particular attention of a man who had watched that boy become someone worth knowing. "You look like something's wrong," Frank said. "Something is," Marcus said. He told him. Not everything, not the LLC details, not the specifics of Devon Sarge, but the shape of it, Claire, the conversation he'd heard, what was being planned. Frank listened without interrupting, his arms folded, his face doing nothing dramatic. When Marcus finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to know everything first," Marcus said. "Then I'm going to be where I need to be when it lands." Frank looked at him steadily. "That's the right way," he said. He did not say anything else about it. He poured himself coffee from Marcus's thermos, sat on the other sawhorse, and asked Marcus what he was doing with the south wall framing. They talked about the south wall for 40 minutes. Then Frank finished his coffee, set the cup on the workbench, and said he'd see him Thursday. He left the same way he came in. Marcus went back to the floor. The weeks between September and December moved with the particular quality of time that has a fixed destination. Marcus went to work. He came home. He ate the dinners Claire made and asked about her day and talked about his projects and gave her nothing that could be used against him and took nothing at face value. He was not performing. He was waiting. Claire, for her part, was performing. She made his coffee in the mornings. She suggested movies on weekends. She touched his arm in the kitchen with a gentle, deliberate ease that he recognized immediately as the posture of someone who needed things to appear settled. She was managing the temperature of the house, keeping it exactly warm enough that he wouldn't look too closely at the walls. He looked at the walls. He saw that she kept her phone angled away at dinner. He noticed that she had started taking evening calls in the second bedroom, which she had always used as a home office, and coming back to the living room with her expression slightly adjusted, slightly more composed than the room required. He noticed that Devon's name had not come up once in 3 months, not even in passing, which was its own kind of information. He tracked it all and said nothing. The workshop on Milstead became his thinking place in those months. He went there every evening he could, changed into work clothes, and spent 2 or 3 hours on the restoration while the rest of his mind ran quietly in the background, processing, organizing, placing facts in their proper relation to one another the way you set boards in a floor, each one's position determined by the grain, by the load it would carry, by what came before and after. He was not in pain exactly. Or rather, the pain was real and he had felt it fully in the first 2 days, sitting in the workshop in September with the linseed oil smell around him and the full weight of what he had heard pressing down on everything. He had sat with it. He had let it be large. And then something had shifted. Not the grief that would come later, in smaller installments, in the ordinary, unexpected moments that grief chooses for itself. But the thing that had been sitting on top of the grief, the disorientation, the sense of having misread something fundamental that had clarified. He had not misread anything. He had read Claire correctly. He had married the woman he believed she was. Something had happened between then and now that changed her, or revealed a layer he hadn't seen, and the difference between those two things mattered to him but not to the outcome. The outcome was the same either way. What mattered was what he did next. He tracked it all and said nothing. Ray checked in every 2 weeks. The LLC documentation was sound. The property records were clean. Everything Marcus had built in the years before Claire was as separate from the marriage as it was on the day he'd signed each deed. What Claire had access to was the joint savings and her claim on the marital home. What she thought Marcus had was the same. What Marcus had was a foundation she hadn't thought to look for. In November, Frank came to him with a specific piece of information. He had been approached, Frank said, by a paralegal at a family law firm in the city. The woman had asked questions about Marcus's business practices, whether Frank knew if Marcus had outside business interests, whether he was aware of any property holdings Marcus maintained separately. The questions were specific enough to indicate a client who had already considered this angle. "What did you say?" Marcus asked. "I said I was a retired contractor who came by to see my nephews work a couple of times a month and I didn't know anything about his financial arrangements." Frank set down his coffee. "Which is true." "It is," Marcus said. "She filed something then." "Not yet, but they're looking." Marcus called Ray that evening. Ray already knew. He had received a document by then, a letter from a family law attorney on Claire's behalf alleging potential commingling of premarital business assets with marital funds and requesting full financial disclosure in anticipation of proceedings. It was a calculated move. Probe the position. See what came back. "It's a phishing letter," Ray said. "She's hoping the LLC looks shakier than it is." "Does it look shaky?" "Not to anyone who looks at the actual records." Ray paused. "But it's going to cost you 11 days while I put together the response, during which she may push for emergency financial protections." Marcus sat with that for a moment. He had not expected this to come so early. He had expected Claire to wait until after the new year. She had moved faster than he'd planned for. He sat in the workshop, the November dark outside the windows, the old building around him solid and quiet, and he thought about what a setback felt like versus what it actually was. He had been on job sites when something that looked catastrophic turned out to be manageable, and something that looked minor turned out to be a structural failure. The appearance of a thing was never the measure of it. The measure was in what the thing was actually doing. Was it holding? Was it transferring load correctly? Was the foundation sound? His foundation was sound. He knew this with the specific confidence of a man who had checked the thing himself, in person, with his own hands over years. He had built the LLC carefully. He had kept the books honestly. He had never once drawn on marital funds for an LLC expense, not by oversight but by intention, because he was a man who understood that what you built needed to be built clean. The letter was a probe, an attorney testing the perimeter looking for soft ground. There was no soft ground. He sat in the workshop, the November dark outside the windows, the old building around him solid and quiet, and he thought about what a setback felt like versus what it actually was. This was not a setback in the thing that mattered. The LLC was clean. The foundation was sound. The letter was a probe, not a strike. He thought about a wall stud that looked wrong in a water-damaged structure, alarming on first sight but sound when you pressed it. Prepare the response, Marcus said. Everything. The original formation documents, every LLC bank statement since 2013, every property tax record, every rental ledger, all of it. I'll have it ready in 10 days. Make it 8. Ray made it 7. The response landed with the opposing attorney on a Tuesday morning and sat there without reply for 4 days. Then Claire's attorney withdrew the commingling allegation without further action. The position had held. Marcus received that news from Ray by text on a Saturday afternoon. He read the message once. He set the phone in his jacket pocket. He went back to the piece of oak flooring he was fitting to the workshop's north corridor. He did not celebrate. Simply worked. He had picked December the 14th, not at random. He had chosen it because it was a Saturday Claire always spent at her sister's in the afternoon, a standing arrangement, 4 until 7, which meant Devon had a window. Marcus had confirmed this through a secondary check. Devon's car had appeared on their block at 4:15 on 2 consecutive Saturdays in October. It would appear again. Marcus would be ready. He told Claire over breakfast that he was going to the workshop. He would be back late, he said. A problem with the south wall framing that he wanted to get ahead of before Monday. She said okay. She was already thinking about something else. He drove to the workshop. He worked for 2 hours. At 3:45 he drove to Elmore Street and he parked under the same oak tree where he had parked in September. He turned off the engine. The window of his kitchen was lit from inside, the same yellow light. He waited. Devon arrived at 4:17. The Lexus parked in the driveway this time, not 2 houses down. Bolder now, more confident in the routine. Marcus looked at the car in his driveway. He thought about what Devon believed at this moment, that the man he was replacing was a craftsman who spent his days building things for other people and his evenings not paying close enough attention. A useful man with limited vision. A man whose grief, when it arrived, could be managed. He thought about what Devon did not know. Marcus got out of the car. Walked to the front door of his house. He used his key. He came in through the hall. The living room was to the left. He could hear voices low, the particular intimacy of people who have stopped being careful. He walked in. Devon was on the couch. Claire was in the chair across from him, the one she always sat in when they watched television. Both of them had wine glasses. The bottle was from the cabinet Marcus kept for occasions. It was a moment before either of them registered him. Then Claire looked up. The color drained from her face with a completeness he had not expected. Devon's expression went through 3 things in 2 seconds: surprise, calculation. Then the smooth, deliberate composure of a man who had needed to manage unexpected rooms before. Marcus, Devon said. His voice was easy, almost friendly. Marcus looked at him. He set his keys on the side table. He sat down in the remaining chair. He crossed his ankle over his knee. He folded his hands. He did not raise his voice. September the 19th, Marcus said. 6:47 in the morning. You were standing in my kitchen telling my wife that I was so deep in my work that I didn't know what I had. The room was very still. I heard every word, Marcus said. I was parked on Elmore. Claire made a small sound, not a word, just sound. I want to be very clear about one thing before we go any further, Marcus said. He looked at Devon. You came into my house and my marriage and you ran an assessment. You decided what I had and what you could move into position for. You made a calculation. He paused. I want you to understand that you got the numbers wrong. Devon leaned forward slightly. He opened his mouth. Marcus looked at him. Devon closed it. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. He placed a document on the coffee table. A single page turned so Devon could read it from where he sat. That's an LLC registered in 2013, Marcus said, 4 years before this marriage. It holds 3 income-producing properties and a workshop building, combined current equity $340,000. He let that settle. None of it is marital property. All of it is documented. The woman sitting in that chair knew none of it because she never asked. Claire was looking at the paper. She was doing arithmetic. He could watch her do it. You assessed a man you thought had a house and some savings, Marcus said. You were looking at the surface. You didn't look at what the thing was built on. Devon's composure had not broken. It had simply hollowed out. The thing that had looked like confidence was showing itself for what it was, a surface, well-maintained, no load-bearing capacity underneath. He picked up his jacket from the couch beside him. He stood. "Claire," he said. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Understanding moving through her in real time, not about the LLC, something more fundamental. About the specific shape of what she had been looking at. Devon set his wine glass on the coffee table. He looked at the LLC document for a moment. His face had the expression of a man reviewing a contract he had assumed would be favorable and discovering it was not. He looked at Claire. She was looking at the document. He looked back at Marcus. "This doesn't change," he started. Marcus looked at him. The sentence ended. There was a quality to Marcus Webb's stillness that people who had worked with him for years understood immediately. It was not hostility. It was not performance. It was simply the complete absence of the kind of uncertainty that Devon was used to exploiting. When Devon walked into rooms, he read the uncertainty in people and calibrated to it. There was nothing here to calibrate to. Devon looked at Claire one more time. She was still looking at the document on the table. He picked up his jacket. Devon left without another word. The door opened. The door closed. The house was quiet. Marcus sat across from his wife and looked at her for a long moment. "You knew what I was capable of," he said. "You were there. You took care of my mother. You sat with her through procedures when I couldn't be there." He did not say this with anger. He said it the way you name something that was real before it was ruined. You knew the kind of man that was. Claire pressed her lips together. Her hands were in her lap. "What are you going to do?" she said. "The same thing I was going to do either way," Marcus said. "I'm going to call my attorney and I'm going to move forward." He picked up the document from the coffee table. He stood. "You should call yours," he said. He walked to the door. He stopped once at the threshold. "The LLC letter your attorney sent in November," he said without turning around. "We answered it. The response was 7 pages. If you look at them, you'll see that everything I built before this marriage is as solid now as the day I built it." He paused. "Whatever was built after it is something else." He left. He drove to his Uncle Frank's house. Frank lived 20 minutes south of the city in a neighborhood where the houses were older than their owners and maintained with the particular pride of people who understood that a thing worth keeping was worth keeping well. The porch light was on when Marcus pulled up, which meant Frank had known somehow, or had simply developed the habit of leaving the porch light on at night, which was also possible. Frank came to the door before Marcus knocked. He looked at Marcus for a moment. He took in the expression on his nephew's face, not grief, something stiller than that, something that had moved past grief into a settled place on the other side. "Come inside," Frank said. He made coffee. Real coffee, not the diner kind, the kind Frank made at the Good Pot, strong and measured. He set a mug on the kitchen table and sat across from Marcus and waited. Marcus told him what had happened in the living room. He told it plainly, the way Frank had always required things to be told in sequence, with the relevant details without excess. Frank listened with his hands around his own mug. When Marcus finished, Frank was quiet for a while. "She underestimated you," he said. "She estimated what she could see," Marcus said. "She just didn't look at the foundation." Frank looked at him. "That's a generous way to frame it," Frank said. "It's an accurate way to frame it." Frank sipped his coffee. He looked at the table. He looked back up. "You know what your grandfather told me once," he said. "First time I got cheated on a contract. Man kept a deposit I'd earned and told me the work wasn't a standard and dared me to prove otherwise in court." He paused. He said, "The thing about being built right is that it doesn't stop being true just because somebody says it isn't. You just have to let the record speak." Marcus held his mug. "The record spoke," Frank said. Marcus nodded. He stayed another hour. They talked about the workshop, about the south wall framing problem Marcus had been working around for 2 weeks, about a property on the east side of the county Frank had heard was being put up for auction. Ordinary things. Solid things. The things that were true before December the 14th and would still be true after it. He drove home at 11 o'clock. He parked in front of the house, his house, or the house that would remain legally his through the settlement process, and sat in the car for a moment. The kitchen light was still on. He went inside. He made himself a glass of water. He stood at the counter in the kitchen where Claire had planned an exit and Devon had made calculations, and Marcus had set 3 properties worth of documentation on the coffee table. He drank the water. He went to bed. He slept through the night without difficulty. In the morning he drove to the workshop, changed into work clothes, and started on the floor section he had been thinking about for 3 days. He worked until 2 in the afternoon, ate a sandwich, called Ray, and confirmed that the filing would proceed as discussed. He worked until dark. He came home. Claire was in the second bedroom with the door closed. He could hear the low sound of her on the phone. He made himself dinner. He ate it at the kitchen table. He washed the plate and the glass and the fork and set them in the drying rack. He went to bed. He lay in the dark with his hands folded on his chest, and thought about what he had built before this marriage, and what he had built inside it, and what the difference between those 2 categories was, and what it meant that the difference was now the only thing that mattered. He thought about load-bearing walls, about how the ones that looked the most important were sometimes decorative, and the ones that looked unassuming were often the ones the whole structure was depending on. He thought about his LLC. He thought about the meeting with Ray in the morning. He closed his eyes. He slept. He left. The paperwork moved with the clean, efficient momentum of a well-prepared case. Ray filed the divorce petition and the full asset disclosure simultaneously, a deliberate move, placing every card face up before Claire's attorney could claim surprise or claim a discovery issue. The disclosure showed the full picture. 3 income properties, the workshop, the LLC formation documentation dated 4 years prior to the marriage, the rental income history, the bank records going back to 2013. It also showed the marital assets, the house, the joint savings account, $82,000 and a home whose equity they had built together. Ray had said it plainly when they reviewed the filing. You could fight for a larger share on contribution grounds. You worked the dominant income. Marcus had said no. He wanted the LLC assets, which were his and his half of what they had built together, no more. He did not want to diminish Claire. He wanted to be accurate. Ray had looked at him for a moment. Half it is, he had said. The commingling allegation had already collapsed. Claire's attorney, with the full disclosure in front of her, did not pursue further challenges to the LLC. She was competent. She could read bank statements. What remained was the house division, the joint savings, the ordinary arithmetic of a marriage being accounted for. Claire did not contest the LLC. She did not contest the disclosure. She accepted, in the settlement negotiations, the half that was hers. She was left with $41,000 in savings, her half of the house equity, which she took in cash after a buyout, and the realization that the man she had been positioned to leave had been standing on ground she had never thought to measure. Devon Sarge disappeared from the picture with the particular speed of a man whose calculations had stopped working. He was not present for any part of what followed. He had no legal standing. He had no financial interest. He had assessed a situation, found it wrong, and moved on to the next one. The settlement had taken 6 weeks to finalize. Claire's attorney was competent and professional, and had looked at the full disclosure without visible reaction, which told Marcus she had known within 24 hours of receiving it that the commingling argument was not going to hold. She had moved her client toward the most reasonable available position without drama. Claire had not contested the LLC. She had not contested the property values. She had accepted the half of the shared assets that was hers, the $41,000 from savings, her portion of the home equity, settled in a buyout that Marcus arranged through a refinance he had been pre-approved for before the settlement negotiations began. He had moved out of the house in January. He had taken his tools, his books, the photograph of his parents from the hall table, and a lamp he had built himself years ago from a piece of reclaimed oak. He had left everything else. He stayed at the workshop the first week, the inflatable bed, his tools around him, the unfinished floor beneath him. It was cold. The furnace hadn't been fully installed yet. He put on 2 sweaters and worked late and slept early, and the week passed with a cleanness that he recognized as something close to relief. He found an apartment in February. 2nd floor, south-facing windows, a kitchen that got good morning light. Small. His. He furnished it slowly over weeks. Not because he was being precious about it, but because he had learned over a long career of making things that a thing built without care would need rebuilding. He was only going to build this once. Ray sent Marcus a brief email when the final paperwork was filed. Clean exit. No disputes. You're clear. Marcus read it at the workshop, sitting on the sawhorse that had become his thinking chair in the month since September. He read it twice. He put his phone in his pocket. He picked up his mallet and went back to the floor. There was a section of heart pine near the east wall that had been troubling him for a week, a slight variation in the grain direction that meant the board would need to be fit differently than its neighbors. Not wrong, not weak, just requiring more care than the boards on either side of it. He fit it. He checked it. He moved to the next one. Frank came by on the first Thursday after the settlement was filed. He came through the side door as always. He poured his own coffee. He looked at the floor Marcus had been working on. He crouched down and ran his hand along 3 board lengths without speaking. He stood back up. Better than last month, he said. The east section was giving me trouble. Frank looked at it. Not anymore. They worked in the same space for 2 hours, Frank doing nothing specific, just present, moving around the perimeter of the room, checking things with the experienced attention of a man who had built enough to know what sound looked like. He did not bring up Claire. He did not ask about the settlement. He trusted Marcus to say what needed saying. After the second coffee, Frank sat on the sawhorse and looked at the ceiling joints. You know what I've always liked about you, he said. Marcus looked up. You build the part no one sees first, Frank said. Most guys start with what's visible. You start with what it sits on. Marcus didn't say anything. Frank stood up. He put on his jacket. He looked at the workshop, the restored windows, the new flooring progressing board by board toward the far wall, the ceiling joints that had taken 2 months of careful work to get right. This is going to be something, he said. He left. Marcus stood in the quiet of the workshop and looked at what he had been building for 2 years. The light came in clean through the restored north window, flat and winter pale, the kind of light that showed you exactly what a thing was without flattering it. The foundation was original limestone, repointed. The framing was rebuilt from the original plan Marcus had found in the county records and spent a winter interpreting. The floor was heart pine, old growth, fitted board by board with the grain running the same direction through every room. It would hold for 100 years. He had built it to hold for 100 years, and he had done it quietly in the evenings and on the weekends, in the space of a life that someone had looked at and seen only the surface. He thought about Devon's words one final time. He's so deep in his work he doesn't even know what he has. He thought about what he actually had. 3 properties producing income. A workshop worth more than the house he was splitting. A career built on the standard of things that lasted. A friend who had given him 7 days of precise, careful legal work when he needed it. An uncle who came by on Thursdays and ran his hand along the grain and said, better than last month, with a quiet satisfaction that contained everything important. He had a foundation. Devon had been right about one thing. Marcus was deep in his work. He had just been wrong about what the work meant. Ray came to the workshop on a Saturday in January, which he had never done before. He brought lunch from the deli on Crawford, 2 sandwiches, wrapped in paper, the kind of lunch that required no ceremony, and he sat on the sawhorse with a coffee Marcus had already made, and he ate without saying much for the first 15 minutes, which was how Ray Alcott communicated contentment. Then he set down the paper wrapping and looked at the floor. How long until it's done, he said. Another 8 months, Marcus said. The south section still needs work, and the north wall has some framing I'm not happy with. What happens when it's done? Marcus looked at the room. "I open it," he said, "for workshops, small craft studios, people who need space to make things and can't afford what the commercial buildings are charging." Ray was quiet for a moment. "At what rate?" "Enough to cover the costs." Ray picked up his coffee. He held it in both hands and looked at the ceiling. 41 years I've known you," he said. 19. Fine, 19. In 19 years you have never once done the thing that would benefit you most on paper." He sipped the coffee. "And things have always turned out to be worth more than the paper suggested they would be." Marcus didn't answer. He went back to work. Ray stayed for another hour, sitting on the sawhorse, saying almost nothing, and the quality of his presence in the room was exactly what Marcus would have said he needed if anyone had asked. He had not known he needed it until it was there. He met Natalie in March, on a preservation project at a courthouse 2 counties over. She was the structural engineer contracted to assess the building's load-bearing capacity before the restoration began. She arrived on a Tuesday with drawings that were cleaner than any Marcus had worked from in years, and she had opinions about the original framing methodology that she expressed without hesitation, and that turned out to be correct. They had coffee after the site walkthrough. They talked about the building for 45 minutes and then about other things for another 30. She was not a dramatic presence. She was simply someone who thought carefully and said what she thought and looked at you when you were talking and meant it. Marcus drove home on the Tuesday evening thinking about the courthouse framing and about the conversation and about the specific quality of talking to someone who was interested in the same things for the same reasons. He did not rush anything. He was not a man who rushed things that mattered. He had learned this the same way he had learned everything, from the work. From the years of fitting boards that needed to be fitted exactly right, and discovering that the ones he had hurried were the ones that gave him trouble later, and the ones he had taken his time with were the ones that held for decades without complaint. Some things required patience not as a virtue but as a structural condition. He held what he felt about Natalie the way you hold a joint you are testing before you apply load. Not forever, not indefinitely, but long enough to know if it was sound. He called her 3 weeks later about the project. They had dinner in April at a quiet place she suggested, and they talked for 3 hours about wood and stone, and the specific stubbornness required to restore something that would have been faster and cheaper to tear down. She ordered the thing she actually wanted from the menu without consulting him. He ordered his coffee black. He drove home afterward thinking about foundations, about how the right kind take time to set, how you don't put load on them before they're ready, and how, when they are ready, they hold exactly what you build on them. The workshop was done in October, 8 months after he had estimated, which, as Ray pointed out when Marcus told him, was the first time in 19 years Marcus Webb had finished something ahead of his own schedule. In the months between January and October, Marcus built. He rebuilt the south wall framing, which had been the problem he deferred through the worst of the legal process. It took 3 weeks. He replaced 7 compromised sections with new timber that matched the original dimensions exactly, sourced from a mill in the next county that still cut to specification. He fitted each piece himself, not because he lacked anyone to call, but because this particular wall was one he wanted to know the way you know something you did with your own hands. He installed the furnace in February. Hot water baseboard heat, old-fashioned but reliable. The contractor he brought in to run the lines was a man he had worked alongside years ago, a quiet man named Gerald who moved without wasted motion and had the same standard Marcus did about what finished meant. He tiled the bathroom himself in March over 2 weekends. Simple field tile, white, a dark grout line, nothing that would date itself. In April, Ray came to walk the building. He was not an inspector. He was simply a man who wanted to see what Marcus had been doing with the place he had driven past for 3 years, and Marcus wanted to show him. They walked it room by room. Ray asked questions about the framing and the floor and the ceiling joints with the precise curiosity of someone who has spent a career reading documents about structures and is now encountering the actual thing. He ran his hand along the north corridor floor the same way Frank did, though with less expertise and with more obvious satisfaction. At the end of the walk, he stood in the main room with the light coming through the restored north window, and he looked at Marcus. "You built this," he said. Mostly. In between everything else. The building didn't care what else was happening. Ray shook his head slowly. The building didn't care, he repeated, with a tone that wasn't quite disbelief but was close to it. Marcus, you have a workshop building worth more than your half of the marital home. You built it with your own hands while your marriage was falling apart. You knew everything that was happening and you just kept building. It needed to be done, Marcus said. Ray looked at him. Yes, he said. I suppose it did. He went back to his car. He turned at the door. For what it's worth, Ray said, I've known a lot of people who do what you did, who take their energy and put it into something real when everything else is going sideways. It almost never produces something that looks like this. He gestured at the room, at the floor, at the light. Then he left. Marcus stood in the quiet and thought about that for a while. Then he went back to work. The day Marcus opened the building to tenants, he walked every room alone before the first of them arrived. The restored windows, the heart pine floor, the repointed limestone, the framing he had checked and rechecked until he was satisfied that what stood above it would stand for a long time. He stood in the north corridor for a while and listened to the building. Buildings talked if you knew how to listen, not in language, in the quality of their stillness, in the way silence felt when a structure was carrying its load correctly versus when it was compensating for something weak somewhere in the system. He had developed that ear over years. He could walk a site and know in the first 20 minutes whether the work had been done with the right standard or cut to the minimum that would pass inspection. You could not fake a building, not for long. The math was always in the structure waiting. Buildings talked if you knew how to listen, not in language, in the quality of their stillness. The particular silence of a structure that was carrying its load evenly, every joint in its proper relationship to every other, nothing straining, nothing compensating for a weakness somewhere else. This one sounded right. It sounded the way things sound when they were built from the beginning, the way they were meant to be built. Frank came by that afternoon. He came in through the side door and walked every room without comment for 10 minutes. He ran his hand along the north corridor floor. He looked at the ceiling joints. He pressed his palm flat against the east wall. Then he came back to where Marcus was standing and looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has watched something become what it was always meant to be. Told you, Frank said. He didn't say what he'd told him. He didn't need to. Marcus nodded. Frank poured himself the last of the coffee. He sat on the sawhorse in the corner, the same one still there, the one Marcus had thought in and built from for 2 years. He sipped the coffee. He looked at the light coming through the restored north window, flat and October afternoon honest, showing the room exactly as it was. What are you building next? Frank said. He said it the way Frank said everything, as a practical question, requiring a practical answer, without sentiment attached. Marcus thought about the courthouse 2 counties over. About the original sandstone blocks that had been repointed in the 1970s with the wrong mortar, and were now trapping moisture and cracking from the inside. About the work that would need to be done to correct 40 years of well-intentioned damage. He thought about Natalie, about the way she had looked at a load-bearing wall on the south side of the courthouse and said, without hesitation, "The problem isn't the wall. The problem is what the wall is being asked to carry that it wasn't built to carry." He had looked at her, she had looked back. She had been talking about the building. He had been thinking about more than the building. He had not rushed that thought. He had held it the way you hold something you want to understand before you do anything with it, carefully, without applying pressure, letting it be what it was. She was someone who thought in structures, who understood that what a thing was built on mattered more than what it looked like, who expressed opinions without performance and expected the same in return. He had called her 3 weeks after the courthouse walkthrough. The call had been about the project mostly. It had also been about other things. They had dinner in April. He had been honest about the past year. Not extensively, not as a transaction requiring sympathy, just factually, the way you state the relevant conditions when you're beginning a project. She had listened without performing reaction. She had said simply, "That sounds like it was worth understanding clearly." He had agreed. The dinner had been 3 hours. He had driven home afterward and sat in his apartment with the lamp he had built from reclaimed oak, and he had thought about foundations, about how the right ones took time, about how you didn't put load on them before they were ready, and how once they were ready, they held exactly what you placed on them. He was not in a hurry. This too was something the work had taught him. He had spent years watching people rush the things that required patience and abandon the things that required only consistency. He had watched contracts fall apart because someone needed the building faster than the building could be built correctly, and he had watched structures fail decades later because the man who built them had been in a hurry when it mattered most to be still. He was not in a hurry. He had his apartment with the south-facing windows. He had the workshop filling up with tenants who came in on weekday evenings and Saturday mornings and made things with their hands in the space he had built for exactly that purpose. He had Frank on Thursdays and Ray on Sundays when there was football, and Petra's 11-page report filed in a folder in his filing cabinet at home against a day he probably wouldn't need it. He had a courthouse in the next county with compromised sandstone blocks and a structural engineer who had opinions about load-bearing walls and who expressed them clearly and listened when he expressed his. He thought about the load-bearing beam in the north corridor of the workshop, the one he had fitted on a Tuesday morning in March, alone, the building cold around him, the late winter light coming in flat and honest through the window. He had fitted it by hand, checking and rechecking, applying pressure in two directions to make sure it held before he moved the next one into place. When it was right, he had known it was right without needing to check again. Some things you knew that way. He was where he was, which was exactly where he had decided to be. Marcus looked at the floor he had laid board by board through one autumn and one winter. He thought about a courthouse in the next county, about a structural engineer with clean drawings and strong opinions, about a foundation that had not shown a crack. "Haven't decided yet," he said, but he was already thinking about it. Some structures look simple from the outside. You drive past them for years and take them for granted. You assume they were always there and will always be there, and you don't think about what they're sitting on. Then the thing that was supposed to be built on them fails and the structures are still standing because the foundation was always the point. That was the whole point. If this one found you, you're exactly the kind of listener I built it for. There's more where this came from. Subscribe and I'll keep building them.